Betrayal, an everyday story of two disciples. As Phil said, last week Liz talked to us about the Marys who accompanied Jesus and were at the cross. It's my task today to talk about two other characters in the Easter story, two characters who didn't cover themselves with glory in the same sort of way that the Marys did. The Marys stood there, the Marys were faithful, the Marys loved Jesus. The two characters that I'm going to talk about, they didn't do so well. There you go. As a child, one of my favourite books was, if this works, got to turn it on? No, must need to be refired. No, we're still not going. Kick it, says Dave. I'll carry on anyway. One of my favourite books was The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Have any of you read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe? At the age of kind of 8 or 9, I can't claim that I understood the deep meanings behind it. It was just a really good story. A lovely story. And in fact, the whole of those books, the Narnia stories, are great stories. Now, this is personal secrets. For years, I have read to Heather at night before we go to sleep. And we've read all sorts of things. But when we first started having children, we saw somewhere a complete set of Narnia stories bound in a box for about, 30p. They're far too good to not go with. And so we bought them. And our kid, I think we only had one at the time, and he was too small to read to. And so I read all the Narnia stories to Heather at night time as we went through. And again, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. This time I understood what C.S. Lewis was going on about. And everything's being dismantled. No, we're still not moving forward. Never mind. I understood what C.S. Lewis was going on about. Yes. So, Edmund met the White Witch. If you want to do it, put your fingers in your ears, sing loudly. I'll tell you when you can stop. Edmund met the White Witch, and he was captivated by the Turkish delight that she was giving out. And tempted, he was drawn into her web and kept stuck inside her web. And as a result of that, he betrayed his brother and sisters. He almost caused the death of a lot of the characters, a lot of the creatures who were living in Narnia at the time. And it was only Aslan coming into Narnia, the Christ figure coming into Narnia and dying and then rising to life, that released Edmund back into fullness, released him from the clutches of the White Witch. Now I thought, this is really interesting. And I had one of those moments. I had called myself a Christian for a long time at this point, but I had one of those moments of personal revelation. If I was the only person to have betrayed Jesus, would Jesus have died for me? The conclusion I came to, you'll be pleased to know, was yes. If I had been the only person, if I had been the Edmund in this whole beautiful and wonderful world, would Jesus have died for me? The answer was yes. And that is, I'm standing here now, and that's all part of that. Today I'm going to look at two of the characters, important characters in the Easter story. Two men who were confidants of Jesus. Two men who were part of his circle, his gathered circle. Two men who betrayed him terribly. Two men to whom you would say, traitor. Isn't that a horrible word? Traitor. It's harsh, and it covers so much. Both of them were personally picked by Jesus, called to follow him. Both of them were part of his group of 12, his special companions who followed him. One of them was steady and reliable. Reliable enough, trusted enough to be given the role of treasurer, which, as Andrew will tell you, is a very responsible job. The other had a reputation of being a bit excitable, shooting from the hip, putting his foot in his mouth, opening his mouth long before he knew what was going to come out of it. And when it did come out, sometimes that in itself got him into trouble. Now, if you were going to choose people, which one would you choose? The one who was reliable, or the one who shot from the hip? The one who was looking after the money, or the one who just kept putting his foot in his mouth at every other opportunity? It's a really interesting thought, as who we would choose in the kind of natural, who we would choose as our person. What was going to happen was going to turn the whole world upside down. Because one of them would turn out to be synonymous with the worst type of betrayal. The betrayal of a trusted friend. The handing over of somebody who was really trusted. Whilst the other would go on to have churches and cathedrals and squares, even cities, named after him. I am, of course, talking about Judas Iscariot and Simon Peter, or just Peter, as he comes to be known. There is no greater insult than to call someone a Judas. You Judas. What an awful thing to be called. To be likened to Peter is a real compliment, really, really compliment. So, I'm going to look at them separately, and then I'm going to draw some conclusions together from them. So, Judas. Judas was one of the 12 disciples, but in every list he comes at the end. Every list in each of the Gospels, he comes at the end, and it's qualified by something like who betrayed him, or who became a traitor. We are not left in any doubt of what the Gospel writers thought about Judas. It's not a good start to our relationship with him when we look at him. It's not a good start. But we mustn't forget that he was chosen by Jesus. He had all the potential to be a good follower of Jesus because he chose him. He was trusted as one of the 12, I've already said. He was given the role of treasurer, which is important. He must have had good qualities, but later on we find that he was dipping his hand, or at least the allegation is that he was dipping his hand into the money bag. And in the passage that Liz read us last week, You know, when Mary broke the jar of expensive perfume, it's a bit kind of doubtful as to what his, he said, oh, you shouldn't do that, give the money to the poor. But you think, money might have been more important than anything else to this guy. We don't know what drove him to betray Jesus. As far as we know, the Sanhedrin, the leaders of the temple, didn't go seeking somebody to betray Jesus. They were going to get him anyway. They were building up to getting Jesus anyway. But when this member of the 12 toddled into their midst and said, I'll hand him over to you, you get the feeling that they would have been absolutely overjoyed. We don't, there's no even a suggestion that they put a reward out and said, anybody who wants to betray him, I'll give you 30 pieces of silver. The money, the negotiation comes after Judas has gone to betray him. So he probably wasn't even driven by the money. But So we'll never know. It says in Luke's Gospel, while he... Oh no, I'm going to come to that in a minute. So it doesn't seem as many, but the accounts of what he did and what he did afterwards, it's really confused, because he died. We know that he died. We know that he committed suicide. But if you read the various gospel accounts, they're a bit all over the place. Now, Simon Peter, he's quite a different character. He was a fisherman. He came from the north of the country, whilst it's thought that Judas came from somewhere around Jerusalem, somewhere in Judah. He had a strong accent. If you read some of the gospel accounts of the just before the crucifixion, one of the servants says, "I know you. You've got a Galilean accent. You're from up north." Think Strong Geordie, something like that. Really, really recognisable accent. He was introduced to Jesus by his brother Andrew and became one of the closest friends. There were three who formed that closest bond: Peter, James, and John. The three who were there at the Transfiguration, the three who were absolutely intimate with Jesus. When we first meet him, he's called Simon. Andrew brought his brother Simon to meet with Jesus. But Jesus gave him another name. He called him Rocky. Petrus, Peter, the Rock. And you'd think there's a bit of a joke there, isn't there? Here's this unstable, shoot from the hip kind of guy, and you call him Rocky. He's the solid one. He would jump in with both feet. As if you read the Gospels, he's there. And Jesus has to tell him off several times through the process of the Gospel reading. One of those exchanges took place just before the Jesus betrayal. So it says in John 13, Jesus was talking about his betrayal and crucifixion, and tells the disciples he's going where they cannot follow him. Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you? I'll lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times. And that, of course, is exactly what happened. Before the cock crows, Peter did, cock crowed, Peter did betray Jesus. It tells us in, moving on from that, it tells us in John's Gospel that says Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because this disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. This is after the moment, of course, when Judas has kissed Jesus and handed him over to the temple guards. But Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of those disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "No, I'm not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. It says, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself, so they asked him, "You aren't one of the disciples too, are you?" And he denied it, saying, "I'm not." And one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, the cock began to crow. The outcomes of those two betrayals, though, were completely different. Judas, overcome by remorse, and killed himself. Peter stuck with Jesus and was reconciled and went on to become the rock that Jesus had named him, the solid man at the very heart of the early church. Now, I don't know how you felt about that when I spoke about the two characters. Knowing I was going to be preaching today, I asked our life group what they thought of Judas. People have all sorts of ideas about Peter, but I was really interested to know what people thought about Judas. And the answers were really interesting. One of them might either shock you or you might actually agree with it. And that is that people felt sympathy with Judas. Does that horrify you, that people should feel sympathetic towards Judas? Judas has been tarred with a brush that will never fade. He can never get over the fact that he was the one who betrayed him. We're told when Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. It's almost like Judas had no choice. Of course he did. He might have been tempted, like Edmund was tempted back in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. But he didn't have to do it. It was a choice, even if it was a passive choice to do it. He didn't have to do it. Judas went to the chief priests and the officer of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. Perhaps you feel it's all unfair. Judas was tempted and then he went and did it. He succumbed to the temptation. Actually, the irony is that the end result is for our benefit. We all benefit because in the end, Jesus died and rose again. So what does it mean for us today? When it comes down to it, betrayal is a terrible thing, isn't it? I don't know about you, but the thought of betrayal and being betrayed is a horrible thing. We hate it because it's about betraying trust. It's about letting somebody down. It's about just being abandoned into whatever's going to happen. And both Peter and Judas were guilty of betrayal. Both Peter and Judas turned their backs on Jesus. And both of them were deserving of the same end. In the word that Dave brought earlier, we were reminded, God reminded us that, we none of us deserve the same end. We all deserve the same end, but yet Jesus has taken us. One of them was reconciled to Jesus and went on to become one of the great fathers of the church. The other one, of course, died. And the reality is that to a greater or lesser extent, we have all been there. I have never spoken to a follower of Jesus, I've never spoken to a fellow Christian who hasn't at some time let Jesus down, who hasn't turned his back, who hasn't betrayed him. And I can remember an occasion at work when, and I've got a fairly happy kind of personality. Things are on. I look on the, my glass is half full, and the sun's mostly shining. Even when it's raining, it's going to shine again. Somebody came to me, somebody I was working with said, "Yeah, you're always happy." And it was a perfect opportunity to witness to the fact that it was the hope that I had that was a bedrock of my happiness. And I just said something like, I was not a happy person, really, and moved on. It happened and I didn't expect it, and then I wasn't prepared, and then I blew it. I bet if I asked each one of you, you could probably find an opportunity, an occasion when something similar had happened to you. None of us can look at those two men. None of us can look at those two men and condemn them, because I'll say me, I won't keep you in it. I'm the Edmund. I have done similar to what they did. I don't know whether you have ever let Jesus down. Jesus never got a chance to forgive or restore Judas. He condemned himself. In his guilt turned to shame. His shame drove him to suicide. I wonder, because I like doing those what if kind of certain situations. What if Judas had gone back and he'd sought out the other disciples and said, chaps, I've done this really wrong, I'm sorry. And then the resurrected Jesus met him. Would he have forgiven him? I'm absolutely certain he would have done. I often think that about Adam, actually. In the Garden of Eden. What would happen if Adam had said, yeah, all right, I should have done that job, but I didn't. Anyway. What if? Well, we don't know. Judas condemned himself. Peter did the opposite. Peter, his shame, his guilt drove him back to the fellowship of the other 10, as it was by then. So how do we react when something terrible or shameful, we do something terrible or shameful? Do you turn away, convinced that you can never be forgiven? Or do you turn to? Have you had something in the past which has driven you away, and it's taken you a long time to come back? Or do you immediately rush back? Judas turned away. His sin was too great for him. Peter turned towards him. Judas thought there was no hope for him. Peter was certain that there was hope. Judas didn't give Jesus a chance to reconcile him. Peter knew of nothing else. So we're left with the question, where are you? Where are we? Judas and Peter are two very human humans. They challenge us to think where we are.